Now students, we will study anatomy of ANS, that is autonomic nervous system. Previously, in our previous lecture, we discussed that what is autonomic nervous system, what are the divisions of ANS. Now in today's lecture, we will study anatomy of ANS. So, we already know that the autonomic nervous system basically consists of two types of neurons, that are efferent neurons and the afferent neurons. Now, in the case of efferent neurons, basically the ANS carries nerve impulses from brain, as I'm representing in the figure, from brain into the effector organ. So, these are the neurons which carry information from the brain to the effector organs. So, there are basically two types of the efferent neurons. One is the preganglionic neuron and other one is postganglionic neuron. As indicated by the name pre, it means these are the neurons which are present before the ganglia, and in the case of postganglionic neurons, these are the neurons which are present after the ganglia. Now, basically the cell bodies of the first nerve cells, that is cell bodies of the preganglionic neuron, is basically located within the CNS as represented by this pink color. So this is the diagram of neuron which is representing that neuron consists of cell body. So this cell body of preganglionic neuron is basically present in CNS. Now, basically, your preganglionic neurons emerge from brainstem or the spinal cord and make a synapse or connection in the ganglia. This blue color is actually representing ganglia. Now, what is ganglia? You already know that ganglia is basically the aggregate of nerve cell bodies. Now, this ganglia is actually acting as a relay station. It is acting as a connection between these preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons. So the cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons, this is the cell body, this is a postganglionic neuron. Now the cell body of this postganglionic neuron is basically in the ganglia. So this postganglionic neuron now will terminate into the effector organ. So this is a series, this is a flow from CNS to effector organs. Your efferent neurons are basically getting signals from CNS, or you can say it is getting signals from the brainstem or spinal cord. And now it is innervating, your postganglionic nerves are innervating the effector organs, and there they are producing any biological effect. Now, what are the afferent neurons? As we have already discussed in our previous lecture, afferent neurons are those neurons which carry signals to brain and spinal cord. So, afferent neurons are basically acting as a signal, giving the signals to the CNS. Now, when we talk about anatomy, according to anatomical point of view, according to anatomy, we divide our autonomic nervous system into two different type of system, or into two major systems. First one is sympathetic division and the second one is parasympathetic division. So, according to anatomy, we can say that our sympathetic division is actually the thoracolumbar division, and our parasympathetic division is actually the craniosacral division. That is where classifying this autonomic nervous system according to anatomy, according to origination of the neurons. Now, we are going to discuss anatomy of sympathetic neurons. The afferent ANS, as we have already discussed, that efferent division is divided into autonomic system and somatic system. And this autonomic system actually contains three divisions: sympathetic, parasympathetic, and enteric. Now, when I talk about the ANS, or talk about parasympathetic or sympathetic, it means I'm talking about the efferent ANS. So the efferent ANS is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And the neurons originate in CNS and emerge to form two different spinal cord regions. Now, I will discuss this point in detail. So, what the author is trying to say, that the sympathetic preganglionic fibers are basically originating, that is the sympathetic preganglionic fibers. I'm talking about sympathetic system. Preganglionic fibers of sympathetic system are actually originating from the CNS, and particularly from where it is basically, or these fibers are basically originating from the thoracic and the lumbar region, and according to new information also from the sacral spinal nerves. So the parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are leaving the CNS or originating from basically cranial nerves, particularly 3rd, 7th, 9th, and 10th. So in this slide, I have discussed origination of preganglionic nerves or the fibers of both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So origination of sympathetic preganglionic neurons is thoracic and lumbar region, but according to new information, sacral and spinal. Now, sacral spinal nerves. So, but in case of parasympathetic, the origination is the cranial nerves, especially the 3rd, 7th, 9th, and 10th nerve. Now, the preganglionic neurons of sympathetic, I have discussed, basically originate from or come from the thoracic and lumbar region, abbreviated as T1 and L2 of the spinal cord. So, and these are basically making a synapse into ganglia, and this ganglia is actually close to the spinal cord. So, this is the spinal cord, and the ganglia is close to the spinal cord. So, in this case, what is happening? This fiber is the possibility of having the short length. So, in the case of the preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system, as this nerve is ending into the ganglia that is close to the spinal cord. So, in this case, this length is shorter. So, I can say that preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system are shorter in comparison to postganglionic ones. So now I have moved towards the postganglionic. So definitely this ganglia is close to the spinal cord. Now the nerves which are innervating from this ganglia, that is the postganglionic neurons whose cell bodies are in the ganglia, will originate from this ganglia and will innervate the effector organs which are far away. So, most thoracic and the lumbar sympathetic preganglionic fibers are shorter, as we have already discussed. Why these are shorter? Because the ganglia is close to the spinal cord. So, according to few articles, we have possibility of the few fibers which are longer in length, but mostly, generally, precisely, these are shorter in length. So, this is the diagram from Katzen book. This is representing that these are the preganglionic nerves. These are all the preganglionic nerves. In the case of the preganglionic nerves, these are present before the ganglia. So these preganglionic nerves, in case of both parasympathetic and the sympathetic and the somatic nervous system case, these are actually releasing the acetylcholine. You can see that they are releasing acetylcholine, which is represented by ACH. Now, in case of parasympathetic nervous system, the postganglionic nerves or the fibers are actually releasing acetylcholine, and here M is representing muscarinic receptor. So, this acetylcholine is acting on muscarinic receptor, while in case of parasympathetic, we have an exception. In case of sympathetic, particularly in case of sweat glands, we have an exception that this postganglionic fiber is releasing acetylcholine, but this preganglionic fiber is basically close to the spinal cord. That is, it has a shorter length, but the postganglionic nerve has a longer length, and it is innervating or the effector organ where it is releasing the acetylcholine, and this acetylcholine is actually acting on muscarinic receptor. Now, in case of the cardiac or the smooth cells, this postganglionic fiber, which is represented by the red color, why it is represented? This is just an indication that it is releasing norepinephrine on alpha and the beta receptors. Now, in case of the renal vasculature, in the case of sympathetic system, this postganglionic fiber is releasing norepinephrine, dopamine, which are acting on the alpha and the dopamine receptors. While coming towards the adrenal medulla, in case of adrenal medulla, the nerve is releasing acetylcholine, which is acting on the nicotinic receptor abbreviated by N, which are present on adrenal medulla. And there, this adrenal medulla is directly releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. While in case of the skeletal muscles, we have the fiber which is releasing acetylcholine, which is acting on the nicotinic receptors. So we can say that that skeletal muscles also contain the nicotinic receptor. So this is the whole description of the figure which I have already discussed. Now, we were talking about the sympathetic nervous system. So the axons of the postganglionic neurons extend from the ganglia to the tissue, that is, they are innervating the effector organs. Now, in most cases, the preganglionic nerve endings are highly branched. They interact with many postganglionic neurons. It means we have an amplified effect. We have an effect of great magnitude. So, I have already discussed this slide of Lippincott that adrenal medulla is basically doing what? That it is releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine directly into the blood. Now, coming towards the anatomy of parasympathetic neurons. In the case of the parasympathetic neurons, they are basically originating from the cranial nerve 3, that is oculomotor, 7, that is facial, 9, that is glossopharyngeal, and the 10th, that is vagus, as well as from the sacral region from S2 to S4. You have already studied these region in your anatomy class. So these are now making synapse in ganglia. In the case of parasympathetic nervous system, this ganglia is near or on the effector organ. It means in the case of sympathetic nervous system, this ganglia was close to the spinal cord, while in case of parasympathetic nervous system, this ganglia is close to the effector organ. It means now there is a greater length of this presympathetic nerve as compared to sympathetic nervous system. Now, again, in contrast to the sympathetic nervous system, preganglionic fibers of the parasympathetic nervous system are longer, while the postganglionic ones are shorter. Why shorter? Because definitely the ganglia is close to the effector organ. So this effector, for example, this is the ganglia and this is the effector organ. So both are close to each other. So in this case, the length is shorter. Now coming towards the enteric neurons. These are basically the collection of the nerve fibers that innervate the GIT tract, pancreas, and gallbladder, and it is modulated by both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. So students, that was all about the anatomy of the autonomic nervous system. Thank you.